Okay, sorry about that. Good afternoon again. Welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us for the kickoff of our 2026 programming season. This year, the National Archives and Records Administration is celebrating America turning 250 years old. Here at the Eisenhower Library, we are doing this by highlighting the 23 accomplishments of the Eisenhower presidency as named by President Eisenhower in a June 1965 Reader's Digest article. Today, we are doing this by welcoming Daniel Vermilya, a park ranger at the Eisenhower National Historic Site, to talk about President Eisenhower's leadership. Welcome, Daniel.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be with you all today. Yes, joining you from the Eisenhower National Historic Site here in Gettysburg. It is a cold, blustery day here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but it's nice to be with you all now. Yeah, what we'd like to do today is talk about President Eisenhower's leadership philosophy and his essential leadership qualities. I'm going to go ahead and bring my slides up here. We'll see if we can get them on screen. Yes, no. There we go. All right. Yeah, so the 1965 Reader's Digest article that was mentioned, in it, General and President Eisenhower reflected on the meaning of leadership, on quite literally what is leadership. And certainly he was a fine person to do that, to reflect on what leadership is and some of the components. And in that article, Eisenhower identified some key things that we'll talk about today with stories that illustrate those qualities from Eisenhower's own life and times. What you're seeing here is a picture of the Eisenhower home here in Gettysburg. What I'd like to do today as well is not just talk about Eisenhower's leadership qualities, but talk a little bit with you as well about the Eisenhower National Historic Site here in Gettysburg and what this place means. This is the only home that Dwight and Mamie owned together. And as such, it is preserved by the National Park Service as a place for visitors to engage with the Eisenhower story and reflect upon these leadership legacies that both Ike and Mamie left behind. And as Ike said in his article, his Reader's Digest article, a handful of known quantities, which I am convinced are the essence of leadership. We'll outline those as part of our program here today. But first, just to say a little bit about the Eisenhower home here in Gettysburg. This is the only home that they owned. They bought it in 1950, ended up using it on and off during the Eisenhower presidential years. Then it ultimately became the retirement home. I think oftentimes our visitors here at the Eisenhower National Historic Site tend to think that Ike's career was nothing but success. It was nothing but triumphs. And an important part of the Eisenhower story, especially when we reflect on his thoughts on leadership and the meaning of leadership, is the journey that Dwight Eisenhower took to these lofty positions, such as Supreme Allied Commander and President of the United States. So here on the screen, I have briefly by decade some of the roles that he had throughout his career. We're certainly not going to talk about each of these in depth, but there were a lot of different positions, a lot of different places he was posted along the way where Dwight Eisenhower had the opportunity to learn about what is leadership, and some very important people who he learned from about the art of leadership along the way, whether it was his West Point class of 1915, the class famously the stars fell on, with 59 members of that class going on to become generals, his positions in the 1920s and Panama, all over the United States, time at the Army War College, studying World War I battlefields in Europe, his time in the Philippines in the 1930s with Douglas MacArthur, and then ultimately during the Second World War, his rise to General of the Army, Supreme Allied Commander, Army Chief of Staff, and then ultimately President of Colombia. All of that led him to the place where in 1950 he purchased his Gettysburg farm here with his beloved wife, Mamie, which you're seeing them here behind their Gettysburg home. And of course, no sooner had they purchased this farm in Gettysburg than that very same fall of 1950, President Truman asked Dwight Eisenhower to step back into public service. He was hoping to retire here, but instead he stepped back into public service to become the Supreme Commander of NATO forces. It's an important part in our site story here, this important moment in time when Dwight Eisenhower had purchased this dream home that he had dreamed of for many years during the Second World War. In December of 1943, he wrote a letter to Mamie saying, you know, when all this is over, let's get a quiet little place far away from cities. And the Eisenhower home that they bought here was that kind of a quiet place far away from cities, but they weren't able to retire here then. Ike went back to Europe to become the Supreme Commander of NATO in 1951, a position he held because of his belief in the righteousness of the cause and the importance of the cause of NATO in the post-war years. And then, of course, following a year as NATO commander, he came home to the United States and was famously elected our nation's 34th president. So all of this is to say that, you know, leadership is obviously a central part of the Eisenhower story. I often ask visiting school kids if they can tell me two big things that Eisenhower is famous for. And most often I'm told he was a general and he was a president. And those are the two big things we're looking for. And those things both have in common the title of leader. So we can safely say that when we evaluate the leadership qualities that Dwight Eisenhower writes about, this is a man who has a sense of what he is talking about. He has lived leadership experiences through the years. So what are these qualities that we're going to focus on here today? Some of the key qualities and characteristics that Dwight Eisenhower wrote about. Well, you see them here on screen. These are the things that Dwight Eisenhower thought made a good leader. And you see Eisenhower, a photograph of him leaning up against a stone wall on the Gettysburg battlefield, taken here in Gettysburg in the 1960s, as he is this elder statesman, a senior statesman, still active in civic life, reflecting on the meaning of leadership in the United States in the 1960s. So what I'd like to do with these is give you a quote from Eisenhower's article about the qualities, and then a couple stories from Ike's life and times to, you know, illustrate what it is that he is talking about with these various traits in this article. So the first trait right up front is selfless dedication. Leaders need to have selfless dedication. So what did President Eisenhower say about selfless dedication? Perhaps the greatest of these qualities is single-minded and selfless dedication to the task at hand. Any leader worth his salt must, of course, possess a certain amount of ego, a justifiable pride in his own accomplishments. But if he is truly a great leader, the cause must predominate over self. An old and respected commander of mine used to say, always take your job seriously, never yourself. And we'll actually return to that last phrase a little bit later on. But a chief thing that leaders needed to have was selfless dedication to the task at hand. And, you know, for Dwight Eisenhower in his lifetime, so many of his leadership philosophies go back to his days at West Point as a cadet. And as he would later write of the experience of becoming a cadet at West Point, this is a quote from Eisenhower's memoir about taking the oath at West Point and what that meant to him. But when we raised our right hands and repeated the official oath, there was no confusion. A feeling came over me that the expression, the United States of America, would now and henceforth mean something different than it ever had before. From here on, it would be the nation I would be serving, not myself. Suddenly, the flag itself meant something. From that point on, 1911 through the rest of his life, Eisenhower always served with his country first and foremost in his thoughts. And there are so many different moments along the way where Eisenhower prioritized his country instead of himself. Even the fact that We are here as an Eisenhower National Historic Site with the National Park Service in Gettysburg. The Eisenhowers chose to donate this property to the National Park Service so that it would be preserved and open for the American people. This is an example that Eisenhower found inspiration from in one of his own heroes, President Abraham Lincoln. In 1954, Ike gave a speech at Lincoln's birthplace in Kentucky where he said this about our 16th president. Abraham Lincoln has always seemed to me to represent all that is best in America, in terms of its opportunity and the readiness of Americans always to raise up and exalt those people who live by truth, whose lives are examples of integrity and dedication to our country. He was a great leader. I would like to remind you of the methods he used in leadership. You can find no instance where he stood up in public and excoriated another American. You can find no instance where he is reported to have slapped or pounded the table and struck the pose of a pseudo-dictator or of an arbitrary individual. I think Eisenhower found inspiration in Lincoln in many different ways. Some of his formative experiences, as we'll talk about, happened here in Gettysburg, a place where he drew from the history of this place that formed his own leadership philosophies. I'm often drawn to or find interesting that in some of Eisenhower's quotes about past leaders, if you take the name of who gave the speech out and some of the names from the speech, you could reasonably infer that this is maybe a quote somebody had given about Dwight Eisenhower himself. And I think that's very true with how Eisenhower described Lincoln as someone who always raised up and exalted those people who live by truth, whose lives are examples of integrity and dedication to our country. So selfless dedication is a key tenet of leadership, the first of the key tenets. But what about the next one? Courage and conviction. In his article, Eisenhower noted, our country, of course, has no monopoly on such dedication. And he went on to cite Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany after World War II, as an example of someone who had both courage and conviction. Quote, he was firm in support of his convictions, as any real leader must be. Most important of all, his every thought and action were directed toward the restoration of his country to an honored place in the society of nations. He never deviated from this high purpose, and personal ambition never clouded his view. Now, Konrad Adenauer, praised here by Dwight Eisenhower, actually would come to visit the Eisenhower farm here in Gettysburg in 1957. This is a photograph of Dwight Eisenhower conducting his barnyard diplomacy, bringing Konrad Adenauer to his cattle farm, showing him his prized Aberdeen Angus cattle. You can see a few of the ribbons that those cows won, photographed here off to the side of this slide. So he didn't just praise Adenauer, but he had him visit his farm in Gettysburg as well. And you think about these praiseworthy words coming towards Adenauer, and Eisenhower emphasizing the need for leaders to have courage and conviction. This is something he knew very well. This photograph of Ike was June 7th of 1944, just the day after the Normandy invasion began. And it shows a tremendous amount of strain and worry on Eisenhower's face, befitting the responsibility of leadership that he had, especially in 1944, when he had to make such a key decision to launch this invasion of Normandy in 1944, weighing all the factors of possible German knowledge of Allied plans, the overwhelming issue of whether the weather itself ultimately delaying things by one day, but whether it would make it impossible to go forward with this invasion. There was so much on his mind, and ultimately he had to have courage and conviction in his belief that this was the right decision and the right thing to do when he launched that Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944. That certainly is a chief moment of Eisenhower, illustrating that belief in his leadership philosophy. But so is another moment in time that came a little bit later on. We'll talk about a little bit throughout our program today, which was Eisenhower's trip to Korea as president-elect in 1952. We'll reference this with a later trait as well. This belief that it's not enough just to say something, but you have to back up your words with courage and conviction in what you say. In the 1952 campaign, Eisenhower promised that if elected, he would go to Korea to visit the front lines of the conflict, to find a way forward, find a way to bring the fighting to a close. Well, it wasn't just an empty promise. It was something that Eisenhower believed in. After he was elected President of the United States in November of 1952, 1 month later, in early December of 1952, Dwight Eisenhower made a secretive trip. They even continued to release press directives from his home in New York to make it seem as though he was still there and not on the other side of the world. But Eisenhower made a secretive trip to Korea and visited the front lines of the conflict. And this was no easy task. This did require real courage and conviction in his promise. As you see in this photograph here, he was just a mile or two from the front lines of this active war in Korea, in a cold, snowy landscape, flying along in these small army planes. By the way, the coat that Eisenhower is wearing here is actually part of our museum collection today. We own now the parka that Eisenhower wore in Korea during this visit. But he went as president-elect to the front lines of a war zone, backing up his promise to go with a real conviction that his experiences as a general would be put to good use by going there, meeting with commanders on the ground. In this last slide, he's standing next to General Mark Clark. In this slide, he's actually speaking with his son, John Eisenhower, who was an officer with the 3rd Infantry in Korea. And he met with other soldiers on the front lines. He actually put himself on the front lines speaking with U.S. troops in Korea, showing the conviction to back up his words and his promises with real action, an important thing for leaders to do. So we have selfless dedication and courage and conviction. Fortitude is the next of our traits here. Closely related to dedication is another vital ingredient of leadership: fortitude of spirit, the capacity to stand strong under reverses, to rise from defeat and do battle again, to learn from one's mistakes and push on to the ultimate goal. Eisenhower was very, very adept at overcoming difficulties throughout his lifetime. And any good leader, in order to achieve something, certainly there are hazards and difficulties to overcome. And fortitude is a key trait for leaders to have in overcoming them. Let's start with his first professional experience here in Gettysburg, really in 1918. He had visited the battlefield 3 years prior with his West Point class. But in 1918, Eisenhower was ordered to come to Gettysburg and take command of Camp Colt, a tank training camp located on the battlefield. Pictured here, you can see some of the Gettysburg monuments in the background of this photograph. Certainly, this was not the assignment Dwight Eisenhower wanted to have. He wanted to go to France to get combat experience on the Western Front. Instead, he's sent here to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And he would later write of his initial thoughts in coming here, saying, quote, "My mood was black." He envisioned years down the line having his West Point comrades and colleagues having reunions, telling war stories, and he was simply talking about stateside training. But he made the best of it. He found ways to make Camp Colt a success, even with limited resources and only receiving one tank several months into the existence of Camp Colt. Eisenhower was able to thrive in this environment, teaching farm boys how to be soldiers and preparing them for their experiences on the Western Front at a tank training camp. And also it was a key moment for him. There were several British military advisors who arrived here, pictured here in this photograph with Eisenhower. And as Ike would write later on, thus began my connection with allies, a word that was to become vitally important to me as the years rolled on. So early in his career, he had this fear that he had missed out in combat in the Great War, thinking surely there would be one of these in his lifetime, and this was his chance to get experience, as so many others he knew from West Point were. But he also had other difficulties in his life as well. Ike and Mamie had 2 kids, pictured here. The black and white photograph is their firstborn, young Dowd Eisenhower. And off to the side, the color portrait is their son, John. Dowd was born in 1917. Ike and Mamie were just thrilled with their firstborn child. They loved him dearly. And tragically, Christmas Eve of 1921, he contracted and came down with scarlet fever. And within just a short matter of time, it was early January of 1921, young Dowd died with Ike in the room with him. This was as Ike would later write, the greatest disappointment of his life. It was a devastating moment, as it would be for anyone to lose a child. The rest of their lives, Ike and Mamie always remembered Dowd's birthday. Ike would get Mamie yellow roses on Dowd's birthday, which was late September. But life did go on. They were able to have their son John, and John having his own 4 kids and have grandkids. But certainly the memory of Dowd stayed with them. I would argue that having that experience of being a father and losing a child ended up playing such a big role in who Eisenhower became as a leader, and that as a general, he hadn't really seen combat himself in his career, but he understood that he was making decisions that would cost lives of those under his command. And he was one who was a parent who had lost a child, and that was one of the things that really gave him the empathy that he had. But he still needed fortitude to get through that. Ike and Mamie both did, that devastating moment of time. And in his military career, he did have setbacks as well. In 1942 and 1943, the first big campaign the Americans waged with the Allies in the ETO in Europe was in North Africa. And there were many setbacks along the way. The defeat at Kasserine Pass, having to relieve General Lloyd Friedendahl for his poor leadership, which was poorly received by U.S. and British forces alike. Rick Atkinson, in his brilliant, I actually have it right here on my desk, in his brilliant Pulitzer Prize winning An Army at Dawn, he wrote of this in North Africa. No soldier in Africa had changed more or grown more than Eisenhower. And as Atkinson would write, Eisenhower learned the hardest lesson of all, that for an army to win at war, young men must die. And it's important to know that the later successes of Normandy and the later ultimate victory in Europe would not have happened without moments like this, and Ike's fortitude to see through them and grow as a commander through moments like what he experienced in North Africa. Humility, that's a key one for Dwight Eisenhower. It's one of the words that we hear a lot when people tour the Eisenhower home. They'll say, wow, this is a very humble space. They must have been very humble people. Eisenhower wrote, "A sense of humility is a quality I have observed in every leader whom I have deeply admired. My own conviction is that every leader should have enough humility to accept publicly the responsibility for the mistakes of the subordinates he has himself selected, and likewise to give them credit publicly for their triumphs." This is something Eisenhower believed in deeply, especially that part about enough humility to accept publicly the responsibility for the mistakes. I think perhaps the greatest story from Ike's life illustrating this was the "in case of failure" message that he had written out. For those who are unfamiliar with this, on the eve of the D-Day invasion, Eisenhower wrote this note pictured here, stating that he was prepared to give to the press in the event the invasion of Normandy failed. It's mistakenly dated July 5th at the bottom, when we think it was instead written June 5th, perhaps showing the stress that he was under at the time, saying, "Our landings in the Cherbourg Harbor area has failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and dedication to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He is willing to take responsibility for mistakes if they go poorly. Certainly, had he had to issue this note, there would have been no President Eisenhower down the line. He was willing to take responsibility for this, for better or for worse. I think also Ike showed tremendous humility in how it came to be that he was a presidential candidate. This photograph showing his kickoff for his presidential campaign in 1952. It's important to know that, when he bought his farm here in Gettysburg in 1950, there was pressure building on him to run for president. He wasn't keen on accepting that. Instead, he became commander of NATO in 1951. But even then, before he left for Europe, he met with Senator Robert Taft, the prospective GOP nominee for 1952. Eisenhower was worried about an isolationist president, and he wanted Taft to support NATO. And he had told Taft that if you would come out and pledge to support NATO, I'll issue a statement that will forever take me out of the running for the presidency. I will definitely step back and take myself out of the picture for this. Taft refused to do that. There was a campaign started for Ike to run. He saw a desire for himself to run, feared what would happen if he didn't for maintaining the post-World War II peace. And as it was said, at rare intervals in the life of a free people, the man and the occasion meet. I did display some humility and reluctance in ultimately running for the presidency. And the other quote that comes to mind when we speak of this for Dwight Eisenhower is in June of 1945 in his famed Guildhall address when he spoke in London, given a great honor, and thousands came out to greet him just over a month after VE Day. He had this moment of great glory and triumph and celebration of him, but he used it to praise those who fought under his command who had secured victory. This photograph that you see here is of some of these World War II dead who are buried here in Gettysburg National Cemetery. It's some of their headstones. But in his speech, Eisenhower noted, "Humility must always be the portion of any man who receives acclaim earned in blood of his followers and sacrifices of his friends." Eisenhower also believed that leaders needed to do thorough homework, and he's seen here pictured in the summer of 1942 as part of the War Plans Office in Washington. Another quality common to leaders is their willingness to work hard to prepare themselves to know their field of activity thoroughly. I have often heard it said of some individual, "Oh, he'll get by on his personality." Well, he may get by for a time, but if a charming personality is all he has, the day will come when he will find himself looking for a job. So how did Dwight Eisenhower illustrate this principle of thorough homework? Well, I think one key way was through his mentorship and education by the great General Fox Connor, who's pictured here in Panama in 1922. Eisenhower was assigned to Fox Connor's command in the early 1920s. And in Panama, Fox Connor brought his own personal library with him and assigned Eisenhower readings. He made Eisenhower a studious scholar of military history, and he would quiz him on these things. And they would talk about, why did General Sherman do this during the Civil War? And what do you think about that? And as Ike would later write, life with General Connor was a sort of graduate school in military affairs. In a lifetime of association with great and good men, he is the one figure to whom I owe an incalculable debt. Virginia Connor, Fox Connor's wife, would write, "They spent hours discussing wars, past and future. Ike has often said that my husband had more influence on him than any officer he served under." And that quote at the bottom, "Always take your job seriously, never yourself," that is one of the many things Eisenhower learned from Fox Connor. Eisenhower's belief in thorough homework is also borne out by the over 900 books that are on display inside the Eisenhower home here in Gettysburg, including Ike's office that you see here with bookcases beyond it. Ike was very well read. He had an extensive library collection, and our visitors today can still see that. Power of persuasion. Leaders also need to be able to persuade others. A trait always noticeable in a successful leader is his ability to persuade others. There are times, of course, when every leader must make a decision and see that it is carried out regardless of what others may think. But whenever men can be persuaded rather than ordered, when they can be made to feel that they have participated in developing the plan, they approach their tasks with understanding and enthusiasm. I think perhaps the greatest illustration of this was Ike meeting with men of the 101st Airborne on the eve of D-Day. Though he wasn't giving a speech here, he was perhaps inspiring them and giving them that power of persuasion through his common humanity with them, not inspiring them with grand words on this occasion, but through his empathy, through getting to know them as persons and as common citizens. He was capable of that great persuasion rhetoric, though, with his famed June 6, 1944 order of the day, telling soldiers, sailors, and airmen under his command, "You are about to embark on the great crusade towards which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." You know, Eisenhower is not known as one of our great orators as president, but messages like this meant so much to those under his command. And as a presidential candidate, you know, he mirrored some of this language when he made that promise in 1952, pictured here in this speech, October 24th of 1952, speaking to a crowd in Detroit. When he pledged he would go to Korea, he echoed some of that same language that he used in his D-Day order of the day. In his speech pledging he would go to Korea, he said, "A soldier all my life, I have enlisted in the greatest cause of my life, the cause of peace. I do not believe it is a presumption for me to call the effort of all who have enlisted with me a crusade." That same word that he had used 8 years before, he was using again as a presidential candidate. First, it was a great crusade to liberate a continent from fascism and tyranny. And in 1952, it was a crusade for peace to bring about an end to war in Korea. Eisenhower also believed that leaders needed to possess these great qualities within their hearts and their minds, saying, "I learned a long time ago that the qualities of leadership wear no single outward badge. It would be hard to imagine two men more unlike in external traits than General Marshall and Winston Churchill. Marshall was remote in manner, often abrupt. I knew no man who could call him an intimate friend. Churchill was convivial, outgoing, full of humor. The give and take of conferences delighted him. He liked people, and people instantly liked him. Yet both men had the same inner qualities of heart and mind that made them great leaders." You know, there were a lot of differences in the leaders whom Eisenhower knew and interacted with, but at the end of the day, they all internalized and believed these principles. To go back to Ike's visit to Korea, you know, he believed so deeply in his selfless dedication to a cause greater than himself, his courage and conviction in backing up his words and his power of persuasion, his humility, his thorough homework, that he wanted to go to Korea, to the front lines of this conflict, meet with men of the 3rd Infantry Division, sit with them in 20-degree weather, eating sauerkraut and pork chops, as he's seen doing here, and get to know them to find a way to bring a close to the Korean War. He was ultimately able to do that. There was an armistice brought about in Korea in the first year of his presidential administration, which for many years to come, when he made lists of his accomplishments, he put that armistice in Korea at the top of his list of things he was most proud of. But he knew that this was a very meaningful thing and it had tremendous consequences, in part because of that trip. Because while he was there, one of the soldiers whom he met, pictured here on the side, off to the side of the photograph, the tallest soldier, Corporal James Murray, he was killed in action just 5 days after having lunch with President-elect Eisenhower. Ike would write, "I am grieved by the report that Corporal Murray has been killed in action. I have fine memories of our brief friendship. He was a splendid young soldier, typical of thousands of our young men who are fighting in faraway Korea for the principles all Americans cherish and for a just peace. My profound sympathies go to his family." This trip shows that all of these qualities were things that Eisenhower internalized and believed in deeply enough to visit the front lines of a combat zone and have lunch with soldiers who would, in some cases, be killed just days later to find a way to advance the crusade of peace. Lastly, Eisenhower believed that you needed leaders believing in these things at every level. I have been talking here about leadership in military and government service, but the same fundamentals apply at every level, in every walk of life. In the Army, good leadership must go down through the ranks to the youngest corporal. In business, there is always need of men who can direct others effectively. In community life, we need men and women who, by right thinking and sound deeds, influence others. This is the way leadership works in a democracy. And from the ranks of little leaders, eventually come big leaders. That's something we tell our students here all the time, that they are little leaders today and hopefully big leaders in the future. Eisenhower himself was a little leader in a sense at West Point as a cadet. and he grew into a 5-star general and the Supreme Allied Commander, and ultimately President of the United States. And he did that again through internalizing these beliefs. And that's a profound legacy of leadership that we can learn from today, especially when we think about the American 250th and how it is that the United States has made it for 250 years. It's because of leaders like Dwight Eisenhower. And here at Eisenhower National Historic Site, at the Eisenhower home, this is the story that we tell as visitors see the only home that Ike and Mamie own together. And what I'd like to do before we take a little bit of time to see what questions you all have today is I'd like to take you virtually into the home with some photographs showing you the Eisenhower home during our presentation here, the home of Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower. So in the front of the home, this is the entranceway. Off on the side, you can see the wallpaper showing state seals of every state and territory except for Alaska. Alaska's seal is not on there, but many others are. Off on the side, there's a guest book where everyone from Ike and Mamie's grandchildren to world leaders would sign in and be welcomed when they visited the farm. And above the guest book is that portrait of John Eisenhower, their son, his West Point portrait that we saw earlier, that is hanging on the wall above the guest book. The living room, by far the most formal, stately room in the house. You're seeing here the fireplace, which was once part of the East Room of the White House for about 20 years in the mid-19th century. It was actually physically part of the East Room of the White House when Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States. Elsewhere in the living room, this is showing the piano in the Eisenhower living room. On top of the piano, there are many photographs of family members, including a signed photograph from the royal family, signed by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and her husband, Prince Philip. Elsewhere, the sun porch, which was Ike and Mamie's favorite room in the home. This is where, as you can see, it's partially obscured by the additional photograph on screen of Ike and Khrushchev, but this is where Ike did most of his painting in the Eisenhower home with the nice natural sunlight there on the sun porch. And it's also where he would meet with world leaders from time to time, including in September of 1959, when Eisenhower brought Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to the farm and introduced Khrushchev to his grandchildren in the sun porch of the Eisenhower home, and also took Khrushchev on a tour of his cattle farm here in Gettysburg. The Eisenhower dining room, a very formal, stately space that was used for, holiday gatherings and formal family meals. When it was just Ike and Mamie eating here at their Gettysburg farm, typically they ate on TV trays out on the sun porch, befitting their down-to-earth style. But here you can see the dining room with its nice place settings and the beautiful chandelier above the table. The general's room upstairs. Ike had a room where he would retire to for rests, for naps, especially after his 1955 heart attack. It's also where he spent a lot of time reading. Some of his books are on display up there, including some of his military history books, as well as the Western novels that he loved to read for relaxation. Ike and Mamie's main bedroom, with its beautiful decor of pink curtains and sheets and green painted walls. In the back of the room, you could see the small desk that Mamie would sit at as she handled her correspondence of the day. Mamie's dressing room, including on her dressing table there amidst her perfume and jewelry, a framed picture, Ike's framed West Point picture signed to the dearest and sweetest girl in the world. Mamie kept that on her dresser. Elsewhere in the home, the den on the other side of the house, a very rustic room. Most of the books in the home are in this room. Definitely a nice rustic Western feel to it. The fireplace that you're seeing in the back was part of the original summer kitchen of the Eisenhower home that dated back to the original structure in the 1700s. And we saw this earlier, but Ike's office again with some of the books on display. The desk itself was made for Eisenhower by his White House staff. It was made from floorboards that were taken out of the White House during the Truman renovations, and then they were built into this desk that was fashioned after one used by George Washington, who was another one of Dwight Eisenhower's heroes and somebody he admired and looked up to greatly. Elsewhere on the property, you're seeing the Green Bank Barn that dates to 1887. It's the oldest standing structure here at the farm. And in the foreground, Ike's famous putting green here at his Gettysburg home. He had his very own putting green to practice his putting and chipping to his heart's delight. As many know, Ike was very fond of the game of golf, playing hundreds of rounds of golf during his presidency. This green was a gift to President Eisenhower by the PGA for his help and efforts in publicizing the game of golf. But this place stands as a testament to Ike and Mamie, to the lives that they lived, and also, you know, a place for us to ask the question of what is it that does make someone a good leader. These are the things that Eisenhower thought made someone a good leader: selfless dedication, courage and conviction, fortitude, humility, thorough homework, power of persuasion, believing these things in your heart and mind, and also having leaders at every level who believe these things. And that in a democracy, it's not enough simply to have a good leader as president, but you need to have leaders in every level of American society and life for this country to work. And that's how democracies work. That was Ike's belief. So, you know, my question to all of you, one thing to think on is, are there things that Eisenhower left off his list that you think should be on his list of leadership traits that help to make someone a good leader? Something that we ask students here sometimes, and it's an interesting thing to reflect on. But all that being said, I am curious to hear what questions you all might have for me. Wanted to leave some time here at the end of our program to answer any questions our online viewers may have, or any of our in-person viewers there in Abilene.
All right. Thank you so much, Daniel. If you're in the room and you have a question, I'm happy to come to you. You can also write it on any of the notepads that are in front of you if you don't want to say it out loud, and I'll read it for you. And if you are in the virtual space, you can add it to the chat and I will see it and I will get to it. So any questions in the room?
Good afternoon. This is a little bit off the subject, but still, you know, in line with the farm. You've been there a lot more than me in the last 6 years. But I would like to know, is it still haunted? And if so, is Mimi still on the back steps going down to Rosie's room?
Is it still haunted? Well, I don't know that it was. I have worked here for 8 years. I've never encountered anything myself. Been in the house many a times on my own. Creaky old house, but I've never encountered much. But if I do, I will certainly let you all know.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I thought I saw another hand somewhere over here.
I'm trying to avoid a little sexism here, but I know, or at least I think he felt this way, but he doesn't use it in his list of qualities of a great leader. And that is gathering a support system. And for him, that would have been Mamie and John and then other people. But he doesn't list that, and I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, you know what? That's a really great point. I
Also,
think, yeah, it's
secretary was that took copious notes for him and was. I just put her on the list as well, but.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't know. I mean, I think in some of the descriptions and quotes that you see, you know, you get a sense that he does have this belief that I think you get from the article, that leaders don't act on their own, that, you know, leaders are you know, they have a consensus with them, you know, of others around them. I would add John and Dolores Money is a very important part of his support system. Sergeant Money staying on with Ike after the war, and the close relationship they had, and the close relationship that Dolores Money had. You know, absolutely, that's a very key part of this. We're actually in the final stages of redoing and opening our welcome center building. It was previously our reception center, and now it'll be our welcome center for the site. And one of the key aspects of our exhibits for that is finding a way to include the ways that Mamie and John and so many others supported Ike throughout his life and his career. And that was all part of his overall legacy of leadership. So yeah, I think Ike would absolutely concur with that. There's not like a specific trait that specifically says that, but I think if you read it overall, you still do get the sense that he has the belief that leaders need the support of others around them.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, I do have two questions online. The first one is, did I ever mentor or appoint any Black leaders throughout his career?
So I would say, you know, he does have a number of key relationships with African Americans. No, like high-ranking Black military officers or things like that. You know, you could call it a mentorship. I would say a friendship that he developed with Sergeant John Money. That's obviously key to Ike's own life and his success. And John Money being with him basically from 1942 through the end of Ike's life. You know, in his administration, E. Frederick Morrow is a member of his administration, playing an important role. He doesn't appoint any Black cabinet secretaries or high-ranking military leaders, but he does have a couple relationships that I would say are appointments or mentorships that would answer that.
Okay, and I'll actually add to that. We did a program on E. Frederick Morrow about 3 years ago. It does live live on our YouTube channel, so if you are interested, you can find it and watch that. The next question is, did Eisenhower's war memoirs originate from daily notes he would take between battles? Were they all included in his memoirs or other historical books?
You know, that's a really good question. So, I mean, Crusade in Europe comes out a couple years after World War II. I'm sure that he is drawing somewhat from wartime notes and also official records, but there's also a lot of, you know, recollections and remembrances involved in that in later years, as there would be when he would write memoirs of his presidency. So I'm sure it's drawing on a mixture of things and experiences. I will say that his book Crusade in Europe, after the publication of that is what they got the money from that they used to buy the farm here in Gettysburg. So there's a direct link between Crusade in Europe and the farm here in Gettysburg. So yeah, I'd say it's a mixture of things from wartime correspondence and notes to recollections afterwards.
Okay, any other questions in the room? Don't be shy.
I did see that Samantha texted to say that was Mary Jean who asked the first question. I didn't see you. I just heard your voice. So I will say hello to Mary Jean. Nice to hear from you.
All right, so I don't have any other questions online or any other questions in the room, so I will close us out if you'll just bear with me for just a moment. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today. If you would like to learn more about this topic or any of our programs, anything that we've mentioned, as I've said, you can check our YouTube channel, but you can also go to our website, Eisenhower Library .gov. We want to thank our program sponsors, the Eisenhower Foundation. We invite you back next month on February 26th, where we will hear from Sarah Rosenbaum from the Milken Institute to learn about the Kerr-Mills Act. If you don't know what that is, you can ask me after. As a reminder, there are surveys on your tables that will help us improve. And if you are joining us virtually, there is a link for a digital survey in the program description. As always, you can find more information about our programs on our website, eisenhowerlibrary.gov, where you can also join our mailing list. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all.